Hi folks, welcome back. Dennis Vitosa, also known as Jeff Noodles, and today we're going to be talking about an individual we've actually never discussed on this channel. Her name is Alanah Pearce. She's an Australian video game writer, content creator, actor, and former entertainment journalist based here in Los Angeles. She's been covering the industry for over a decade and has a long history on the internet. Now, the reason we're covering her today is because on my X feed the other day, this tweet from Smash JT came up. It said, Alanah Pearce comes to America from Australia, works under an O1 visa for years, eventually obtaining a green card for permanent residency, is given huge opportunities working at massive gaming outlets like IGN and writing for studios like Sony Santa Monica. And then she posts a video titled, America Sucks, by the way. He then says, absolutely fuck this commie. And that piqued my curiosity because I don't think America sucks. And I think it's relatively retarded if you're somebody who immigrates to America from any region of the world and then says America sucks. Because here's the thing, you can just leave if you don't like it here. But I'm not going to get too far ahead of the topic here. I've watched the first bit of this video, but let's dive into the whole thing. I'm going to provide you guys with an in-depth review and commentary on what she's saying because, look, I don't know the ins and outs of the gaming industry or the specific section of the gaming industry that she inhabits. I don't know much about her history on the internet, but I do know one thing. If you're going to talk shit about America, I am going to come after you and respond because I love this country. And like I said, if you're not happy here, you could just leave. Anyway, here's Alanah's video. Let's jump into it.
I had someone ask me on a stream the other day why Asian countries like Japan aren't facing the same truly insane wave of layoffs that the games industry in Europe and North America have been since 2022. We are over 50,000, by the way. 50,000 people have lost their jobs in an industry that is making record money. If you would like a full breakdown of why we're at 50,000, here is a comprehensive video of why the games industry broadly is in the position that it's in. But when it comes to Asia specifically, I get why this is confusing, especially because a lot of Western studios, even ones who have faced tremendous layoffs, are owned by Asian companies. Sony is a great example, a Japanese company that recently shut down fairly beloved studio Bluepoint, who were based in Austin, Texas. Bungie, also owned by Sony, but operating out of Bellevue in Washington, recently lost 300 employees. Riot Games is 100% owned by Chinese mega publisher Tencent. They've laid off just under 100 people this year across the US and Europe. Nintendo has done this. Square Enix did it very recently. It happens across the board. It's happening in other industries too, of course. Giant Japanese pharmaceutical company Takeda Pharmaceutical recently announced plans to cut 4,500 jobs in order to save around 200 billion yen annually. Yay for the stock market. And the employees that are being laid off are in Europe. Basically, companies that are headquartered in Asia are still laying people off, just not all that often in Asia. It does also still happen in Asia, to be clear, sometimes. Tencent did just lay off 100 employees from the Shenzhen, China-based studio Timi, I think is pronounced, studio group, who are most well-known for mobile games like Call of Duty Mobile and Honor of Kings, for example. But most of the stories that I feel like I hear out of Asia are like the direct opposite. I'm reading this paragraph from Lewis Gordon at The Verge because they summarized it perfectly. It says, in recent years, Japanese companies and studios such as Sega raised salaries by 33%, Koei Tecmo upped wages by 23%, employees at Persona maker Atlus saw their incomes jump by 15%, and Nintendo gave its employees a 10% raise. Most recently, Capcom increased graduate salaries by 27.7%, describing it as an investment in the people who support the future of the company. And all of this is benefiting people specifically in Japan. So yeah, I get why it's confusing. Why are there so many layoffs in the US and Europe, even at Asian-owned companies, when their Japanese counterparts are getting goddamn raises? The reason for this may shock you. Women.
What?
I'm joking. It's actually the law and also culture. But let's start with the law, which is honestly really gross, which you'll see when we get into it. But for the purposes of keeping this relatively cohesive, I'm going to largely look at Japan. And as part of that, I did interview Shuhei Yoshida, who is both Japanese and was the president of the SIE Worldwide Studios, as in PlayStation Studios from 2008 to 2019, and two other Japanese games industry professionals who have asked to remain anonymous. The most that I can say is that one is a producer at AAA Studio effectively in Japan, and the other worked at Nintendo for many years, but no longer does.
Now, right off the bat, there is a lot going on here. She's flooding you with data, but there are assumptions and conclusions embedded in the data that she's presenting. As you'll notice, she's not really presenting this information neutrally. She's already crafting an argument right in this 2.5-minute introduction. She's setting you up so that she can carry you into the conclusion that she's going to present toward the end. Now, that being said, she hasn't actually made her core argument yet. She's mostly just setting it up. But even at this stage, there are several places where the framing is misleading, incomplete, or just illogical, right? And we're going to take it step by step. First off, her claim that 50,000 people lost their jobs in an industry that's making record money is a classic composition fallacy. Even if the global video game industry is generating record or near record revenue, that does not mean every publisher, studio, business unit, or project is profitable. Industry-wide revenue can rise while individual studios lose money. Projects can get canceled, companies can overhire, costs can increase, and particular segments can contract. Revenue also doesn't equal profit. That's just basic mathematics. And the juxtaposition that she's presenting implies, without actually establishing, that these layoffs are irrational or primarily about companies extracting more money despite having healthy underlying businesses. So again, she's already crafting this almost socialist argument right off the bat. Anyway, taking it a step further, there's also a selection bias problem with the salary increase examples. She cites several salary increases, but those examples can all be true without demonstrating that Japanese game workers generally receive enormous raises while Western workers are getting fired. See, these may involve different employee categories. Even her example of graduate starting salaries increasing by 27.7% is not the same thing as giving the existing workforce a 27.7% increase. So it's just misleading overall. And the comparison also doesn't adequately account for exchange rates and Japanese wage conditions. Japanese wages have historically been relatively stagnant, and the yen underwent substantial depreciation during much of the period that she's discussing here. That being said, she's not taking market conditions into account, as I mentioned earlier, right? Perhaps these wages are adjusting for some other macroeconomic factor that affected the Japanese economy, and they're raising these wages in order to continue hiring people or holding on to their existing employee base. There are all sorts of potential explanations that aren't being considered, and that leads into her biggest leap in logic, which is when she says the reason for this is actually the law and also the culture. She hasn't demonstrated that. Obviously, she kind of hints at it, and presumably she's going to try to establish it later, but she hasn't demonstrated how Japanese labor law and culture are the explanation rather than simply contributing factors. There could be a lot of different variables influencing this dynamic that she's highlighting. Now, that being said, her most cynical phrase is when she says, "Yay for the stock market," which is just rhetoric. It's not actual evidence. The Takeda example she's citing implies that eliminating 4,500 jobs to save 200 billion yen is principally about rewarding shareholders, but cost reductions of that sort could be responses to declining margins, restructuring, expiring patents, R&D costs, debt, changing demand, or simply attempts to keep a business competitive. I mean, sometimes it's just about looking at the market and the general outlook for many years ahead. If you're looking exclusively at current conditions to justify every single decision a company makes, you're not actually understanding that a lot of businesses try to look forward. Governments do this as well. In fact, many years ago, Moody's lowered California's bond rating because they were anticipating that California would have difficulty dealing with certain expenditures in the years ahead relating to energy. And those kinds of forward-looking assessments are exactly the point I'm trying to make. So a lot of these measures could be preemptive based on the market outlook. And if you don't take that into account and instead you just try to flatten everything into, hey, rich people bad, stock market bad, you're appealing to simplistic rhetoric that isn't really grounded in a complete analysis of reality. And it's just kind of communistic in fashion. Let's be real. It does seem as though she's going to step into the territory of making sweeping generalizations about the Japanese and American labor markets and the gaming market more broadly. But again, we're not going to get ahead of ourselves. We're going to observe and see exactly what her commie propaganda really is.
Japan has what it is called a legal doctrine of abusive dismissal, which basically says that unless an employer can actually prove that they are firing someone for one of a few permissible reasons, that firing is considered abusive and is thus invalid and illegal. This is a whole process. The firing company straight up has to provide paperwork regarding whatever misconduct an employee may have committed, and there's a whole bunch of things taken into consideration surrounding this. It is a huge deal. Like, what are the damages caused by the employee's misconduct? Does the employee have a history of misconduct misconducting? Or this is just a one-off thing? To what extent did the employee try to correct their behavior after doing their misconducting? Like, it's not just like they do one thing and they get fired. They legally have to be given second chances, effectively, again, depending on the actual work crimes committed. You can't even fire someone for just being bad at their job without proving that you tried to get them a job that they might be better at or training them for a different position. As such, there are many examples of Japanese employees being fired, suing their ex-employers, and winning, and as a result being rehired, which has got to be real awkward. Can you imagine? Other countries producing a lot of games right now, like South Korea and China, are, of course, a little different, legally speaking. They're different countries, but their regulations are ultimately to very similar effect. For example, a Chinese company recently tried to reassign a worker to a different department, and in doing so, cut down their salary. Obviously, because they can't easily fire people, reassignment is the next best bet. Specifically, in this case, though, they were trying to replace that human worker with AI. The Chinese government has officially made it illegal to replace human workers with AI. You can do that in America, though. Fuck yeah, freedom. Comparatively, it's just real easy to fire people here in the US. The US has what they call an at-will employment system, and it's one of the only countries that operates this way in the entire world. It basically means you can be fired at any time for any reason, and that you can quit at any time for any reason. You can be fired in the US basically because your boss was having a bad day, and they will face zero legal repercussions for this. Turns out Montana is actually the only state in the entire country that doesn't technically operate this way. Shout out to Montana. The only exceptions to this rule in the US are discrimination-based. You can't be fired based on race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, sexual orientation, or gender identity, national origin, age, if you're 40 or older, disability, and genetic information, including family medical history. You can't be fired for reporting sexual harassment. You can't be fired for whistleblowing, and you can't be fired for union activity. Otherwise, game owned by Japanese company didn't meet sales projections? Cool, let's lay off the Americans, because it is incredibly easy to do so. Get them out of here. There are some protections in place regarding layoffs specifically, but it's just you must give employees notice and pay and give them insurance for a specific amount of time. It's genuinely really depressing. It feels like the US and European employees are like stock market fodder for companies headquartered in countries where they aren't allowed to treat employees like actual trash. But even Europe, which of course also varies a ton by country, generally has much stronger worker protections than the US. China has actually developed a sort of term for their criticism of US treatment of workers and people in general. You may have heard of this. It's called the kill line. This is a term that originated on Chinese social media. This is so brutal. It kind of refers to a threshold at which a productive middle-class person living in the US is only one single medical, financial, or legal struggle away from irreversible collapse. They posit that most Americans live on this kill line. Most are just one disaster or really bad day away from immense debt and potentially homelessness. And this is a result of lack of social security systems or safety nets across the board. The at-will employment system clearly contributes here, and it means that a lot of the rest of the world, including games industry professionals globally, including working in Asia, see the US system as just incredibly brutal. I mean, I personally have terrible insurance that I pay $500 a month out of pocket for, and if I were to get into an accident and lose a limb, I think I would have spent my life savings probably within the first hour of being hospitalized. Like, the ambulance ride itself would wipe up my entire bank account. That's why it's like GoFundMe or nothing in the US, really. If you weren't good at socializing in the US, honestly, you're kind of screwed. Like, better hope you have some friends who are willing to write a nice paragraph about you and share a link, my guy. That's how it works here. If not, guess you'll just die.
Well, there's a lot going on here. It almost seems like this person just hates America. And by the way, the title should have given it away to me. I don't know why I'm surprised. It really does seem like this chick hates America. I mean, why don't you just move to Japan then? Get employment there. Go to China, work in South Korea, go to Europe. You said Europe has stronger labor protections. Go to those countries if you hate America this much. Needless to say, look, we're not going to touch on the healthcare stuff first. We're going to talk about that later, and I do recognize that there should be considerable reforms when it comes to healthcare, but what she's doing here is just a false equivalence all around, and it's also an incredibly negative way of looking at the American labor market. Part of the reason the American labor market is able to generate as much innovation and entrepreneurship as it does is because you have considerably more flexibility when it comes to hiring, firing, and restructuring a workforce. Just think about this as a business owner. Imagine that you can't even reassign somebody to a different job without potentially exposing yourself to some enormous legal battle. All of a sudden, you're stuck with this individual. the person potentially sues you, and now you're spending money defending your business. How are you supposed to operate businesses if you can't reorganize people into different kinds of jobs as conditions change? No business can permanently exist in exactly the same form. A business depends on developing new products, staying ahead of its competitors, adapting to changing technology, and continuing to sell products in order to maintain its position in the marketplace. If a business cannot do all of these things with relative agility, eventually it's going to implode. And that's really what she fails to understand here. Part of the logic behind America's relatively flexible labor market, and particularly at-will employment in most states, is that it gives employers and employees substantially more flexibility in forming and ending employment relationships. That doesn't mean employers can literally fire somebody for any reason whatsoever. There are federal and state protections against discrimination, retaliation, certain whistleblower firings, violations of contracts, and other unlawful terminations, as she herself cites here. But compared with countries where terminating or restructuring employees can be substantially more difficult, America generally gives companies greater flexibility. And America is unquestionably one of the world's dominant environments for startups, entrepreneurship, venture capital, and technological innovation and development. I wouldn't say America literally has more entrepreneurs than every other country in the world combined, because that's just too broad of a claim to substantiate. But the United States has produced an extraordinary concentration of high-value startups and some of the largest and most innovative companies in the history of the world. And that's part of the reason America has been able to accomplish what it has accomplished in roughly 250 years, when civilizations like China have existed for far longer, didn't achieve comparable technological and economic dominance during the same stages of their development. I mean, look, folks, as I mentioned, China has existed as a civilization for literally thousands of years. And America put human beings on the moon less than 2 centuries after declaring independence. Why is that? Well, let me tell you. The American system, the American employment system, the entrepreneurial system, the capital markets, the culture of risk-taking prioritizes innovation, agility, competition, and the rapid creation of goods and ideas. And if you want to forego some of that flexibility for a more cushy system, there are several places around the world where you can do that. I'm not saying people can't struggle here in America, especially when you're starting off with college debt and dealing with an increasingly expensive cost of living. There are a lot of things we can fix in our system, but I would go as far as to say that whenever you create regulations, whether they're employment regulations or other forms of excessive market regulation and control, you have to recognize that you're creating friction. And that friction can ultimately slow down hiring, investment, entrepreneurship, and innovation. There's always a trade-off. You may create a system where grandpa has extraordinary protection and can keep his job for decades, but you also have to consider whether his grandson is going to be underemployed, because employers are reluctant to hire somebody they may have enormous difficulty letting go later. That's the part of the equation that she doesn't seem interested in discussing. I mean, look, just another example. Look at Singapore. One reason Singapore has developed into such a competitive international business environment is that it has relatively low barriers to establishing and operating companies and an economic system designed to attract investment. Now, I'm not entirely sure how every aspect of their marketplace works when it comes to employment, and Singapore does not have American-style at-will employment in the strict sense, but it is often characterized as having a comparatively flexible and employer-friendly labor environment. So there is obviously a balance that can be struck between worker protections and maintaining a dynamic labor market. And again, there's another problem with her argument. She presents America as though you can simply be fired with zero protections, and she undermines her characterization by acknowledging that protections do, in fact, exist, as I mentioned earlier. There are numerous federal and state protections that prevent employers from firing people for legally prohibited reasons. At-will employment does not mean your employer can legally fire you for absolutely anything. Generally, it means either party can terminate the employment relationship without having to establish cause, unless the reason itself is prohibited by law or applicable contract changes to that relationship. Now, as far as the healthcare aspect of this goes, I'll tell you this. Our healthcare system does have serious issues. It absolutely does. But one of the biggest problems with talking about American healthcare is that people look at what healthcare costs today and simply say, see, this is what the free market does, except this isn't some completely free market anymore. The American healthcare market has been regulated and manipulated by our government for decades, and the Affordable Care Act dramatically increased that regulation. The ACA didn't come in and magically make healthcare affordable. It imposed new mandates and requirements on insurers, changed what plans were required to cover, changed how insurers were allowed to price risk, expanded subsidies, imposed restrictions on the types of coverage insurers could offer, and fundamentally changed the individual insurance marketplace. All of those regulations have costs, and those costs don't just disappear because the government says insurance companies have to provide something. They get passed through the system, and ultimately somebody has to pay for them. And that's what happened with insurance premiums. Before the ACA was fully implemented, the cost of purchasing insurance varied drastically depending on whether you were buying coverage independently or receiving it through an employer. The majority of Americans were already receiving coverage through their employers, and employer-sponsored insurance was, and still is to this day, the largest source of healthcare coverage in the United States. Roughly 150 to 160 million Americans receive health insurance through an employer today. But if you were purchasing individual insurance before the ACA, average premiums could be dramatically lower than what many people ended up paying afterward. Now, obviously, those old plans weren't identical to ACA compliant plans. That's actually part of my point. The government came in and said, essentially, these are the things your insurance has to cover. These are the people you have to cover. These are the ways you're allowed to price coverage. These are the plans you're allowed to sell. And then people act shocked when the price of the product changes when the government is literally telling businesses how they should do their business. It's basic math when you look at it. You regulated what insurers were allowed to sell and how they were allowed to sell it. Of course, that's going to affect the price that the consumer is paying. I experienced this personally. When the ACA was first being implemented, I was in my early 20s and my healthcare coverage was about $200-something a month. Eventually, I was looking at something closer to $800 a month. I just couldn't afford it anymore. I was underemployed at the time. So when I hear somebody like Alana saying they're paying $500 a month for health insurance and using that as an indictment of America, my immediate response is maybe we should actually look at what happened to this market and why coverage became so expensive for everybody. Because this is exactly what I'm talking about when I say regulations can have enormous unintended consequences on the marketplace and the consumer's ability to exist in that marketplace, especially when it's something as essential as healthcare. You can pass a law saying insurers have to cover more things, can't price certain risks the same way they did before, and have to comply with an increasingly complicated regulatory structure, but you haven't magically eliminated the costs that you're trying to regulate. You just redistributed it. Somebody still has to pay for those costs. And that's the fundamental economic problem here. If you require an insurance pool to absorb more expensive risks while simultaneously restricting how insurers can price those risks, the additional costs have to be absorbed somewhere else. They can be shifted onto the policyholders through higher premiums, shifted onto taxpayers through subsidies, shifted onto employers, or absorbed through some combination of those mechanisms. But the cost doesn't just vanish. And that's one of my fundamental criticisms of the ACA. Instead of addressing the underlying costs of healthcare through a genuinely competitive market, we made the insurance market more complicated, layered additional mandates and subsidies on top of it, distorted pricing even further, and then acted surprised when millions of people looked at their premiums and said, why the hell is this so expensive? And that's ultimately the problem with pretending healthcare is free. Under universal healthcare, it isn't free. You're just changing how healthcare is financed. Instead of paying primarily through premiums, deductibles, employers, and direct spending, you're shifting more of the cost into taxation and government budgets. Universal systems can absolutely provide benefits like broader coverage, potentially lower administrative costs, and stronger bargaining power over prices. I'm not going to pretend those advantages don't exist, but they also involve trade-offs. Depending on the system, those can include higher taxes, much higher taxes, government budgeting constraint, longer waits for certain elective procedures or specialists, rationing of care, narrower access to particular treatments, and political decisions about how limited healthcare resources are allocated. You're basically allowing a bureaucrat to decide what kind of treatment you get, how you get it, and whether or not you're allowed to get it. Meanwhile, a market-oriented system can provide faster access and stronger incentives for medical investment and innovation in some areas, but it can also produce high prices and leave people exposed to catastrophic bills, as we discussed. So the serious argument isn't universal healthcare is free versus markets are perfect. Neither statement is true. The question is which combination of competition, regulation, subsidies, catastrophic protection, and public assistance produces the best balance of access, affordability, quality, innovation, and individual choice. All that being said, I have said in interviews before, as far as healthcare coverage goes, no American should be going bankrupt as a result of a catastrophic health bill. That is a travesty. That's something that should not be happening in this country. And I've suggested numerous times that instead of spending tens of billions of dollars overseas every year through foreign assistance and financing wars and foreign governments, we should prioritize Americans who are facing catastrophic circumstances here at home. We provide foreign assistance across a very large number of countries and programs every year. About 177 countries receive assistance from the United States every year, including substantial assistance in recent years to Israel, Ukraine, Argentina. My argument is that some of that money could instead be placed into a catastrophic healthcare fund so that if an American experiences a genuine medical emergency, the resulting bills wouldn't bankrupt them. There would be a backstop. You preserve a largely market-based healthcare system. You repeal the ACA, but you establish a last resort mechanism ensuring that somebody doesn't lose their house or destroy their family's finances because they got cancer, suffered a catastrophic accident, or experienced some other medical emergency they couldn't possibly have anticipated. And we already understand the basic concept of emergency backstops. California has mechanisms that illustrate parts of what I'm talking about, although they're not identical to the healthcare proposal I'm describing. The California Fair Plan, for example, functions as an insurer of last resort for property owners who cannot obtain adequate coverage in the conventional market, particularly in areas with extreme wildfire risk. It's supported through participating insurers and premiums rather than simply being a normal taxpayer-funded insurance program. California also has the California Earthquake Authority, which is a separate publicly managed, privately funded organization that provides earthquake insurance through participating insurers. These systems aren't perfect analogies, and California's property insurance market is currently under enormous strain from wildfire exposure, rising rebuilding costs, insurer withdrawals, regulatory disputes, and the growing concentration of high-risk properties in last resort coverage. But the broader concept is what matters. You create a backstop for catastrophic risk without necessarily replacing the entire private market with a government option that is just going to raise your taxes and reduce your access to care. And all in all, that's closer to what I would personally advocate for in healthcare. Create safeguards so there is a genuine last resort option. If you can demonstrate that a catastrophic medical bill is beyond your reasonable ability to pay and would inevitably force you into bankruptcy or severe financial hardship, then a national catastrophic care fund steps in and covers some or all of that qualifying expense. You could means test it, establish strict definitions of catastrophic care, require insurance to pay first where applicable, negotiate the medical bill before the funds pays for it, and create anti-fraud protections so hospitals and insurers can't simply dump inflated costs onto taxpayers. That said, you're not nationalizing the entire healthcare system like these socialist commies suggest. You're not telling everybody the government suddenly controls every doctor, hospital, insurance plan, and healthcare decision. You're preserving competition and individual choice while establishing one fundamental principle. In the wealthiest and most innovative country the world has ever seen, a genuine medical catastrophe should not financially destroy an American family.
Speaking of fun cultural quirks like dying because you weren't friendly enough, Japan specifically has some fun ways around not being able to legally lay people off. If by fun I mean basically torture, which, you know, at this point, if it's torture being laid off, considering everything we just spoke about, I'm going with the workplace torture. It's not all sunshine and rainbows in Japan, obviously. They basically just have different means of dealing with these ongoing struggles in the industry. Madogawa is a term that means seats by the windows, where certain employees, whether that is is employees that are not performing well professionally, or a company is actually looking to downsize, they are literally pushed to seats by windows because it's so difficult to fire people. So I asked Shuhei Yoshida specifically about this because there aren't a ton of official sources on the topic, and he said these employees are given no daily tasks and are encouraged to find new jobs outside the company. They are still paid by the company, so some employees just spend time in the seats doing nothing and collect salaries, but others use this time to find new jobs outside the company. Basically, they try to bore people until they leave. Companies also work around these restrictions by relying more heavily on contractors. It's much easier to cut contractors, being that they could just not renew contracts, same in the US. And even beyond that, a reduction in outsourcing has actually made it look like the workforce has not diminished in Asia because full-time employees have not been affected, but overall jobs actually have. So considering all of this, that they are still attempting various ways to get rid of people in a just significantly more challenging legal system, why is Japan still giving out raises? This ties into Japan's post-war lifetime employment system. We're going back to World War II. After World War II, Japan had to rebuild an economy that had been devastated by war while also rapidly industrializing. So Japanese companies built this model where they recruited workers straight out of university, trained them internally extensively, and sort of as an exchange expected them to stay with the company for most of their careers, if not their entire careers. This culture varies person to person and company to company and isn't as prevalent as it once was, but it's still a very significant difference to how Western countries tend to approach the job market. And there are huge upsides. Shuhei said, Japanese employees in the traditional Japanese companies tend to see the company they work for as more than the place that they get income, but see it as a community they belong to. They believe management and other employees are community members, and harmony is very important for everyone. Which, yeah, sounds kind of lovely. There are also, obviously, downsides. Japan is notorious for its insane work hours, for example, and for the corporations themselves, it has actually made the job market uniquely very, very competitive. On this, Shuhei said, as the number of new graduates from universities reduces every year, companies in the competitive industry, like the video game industry, find the only way to hire talented new graduates is to raise salaries. The ex-Nintendo employee that I spoke to said, raises are part of an ongoing effort to both cultivate loyalty and project an image of job security in order to attract the best possible candidates. Because Japanese workers will often stay at companies until retirement age, which is around 60 in Japan, you have to impress talented workers from before they even join if you ever wish to work with them. An added challenge here is that their population is pretty rapidly shrinking, and thus their recruitment tactics have become even more competitive. The Japanese population has gone down by 3 million people in the last 5 years, which is pretty wild. So basically, Japanese companies have been trying to be as appealing as possible to high-quality workers, lest they not be able to access them at all, ever. This is helpful to the Japanese games industry in another way. It might seem obvious, but retaining talent is especially valuable in long-term creative projects like game development, and I mean literally valuable, like monetarily valuable. The Japanese producer that I spoke to said that the cost of hiring a brand new employee in order to replace someone who has left would be over $100,000 in Japan. The loss of experience and company understanding is one thing, but time and investment needed to train someone new into a non-junior role is another, especially when Japanese companies very regularly train their employees across multiple disciplines. And yeah, I mean, it takes years and years to replace this kind of expertise, which is akin to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Final Fantasy Remake Trilogy director Naoki Hamaguchi recently told Bloomberg that staff retention is one of the main reasons he thinks that the trilogy has been so successful and that they've been able to produce these huge games so quickly. Which, yeah, games are not factories where you can just swap one guy for another guy and get the same output. A senior designer, programmer, artist, or writer has years of institutional knowledge about why something works the way it does at a certain studio in a certain engine and what has failed before, thus what mistakes not to make again. This is the kind of knowledge that people don't really tend to write down. It's somebody's lived experience that really only lives in their brains. You lose all of these things with layoffs. Just how weird that only Japanese CEOs seem to have figured this out. But yeah, it means that their potential for high-quality games is higher, which could inherently lead to less layoffs. A wonderful cycle. Japanese leadership also seems to think employee morale is valuable for some reason.
Propaganda piece for Japan?
Why? In 2013, Satoru Iwata famously cut his salary by 50% in order to protect employees from job cuts after the Wii U sold poorly. He said, if we reduce the number of employees for better short-term financial results, employee morale will decrease, and I sincerely doubt employees who fear that they may be laid off will be able to develop software titles that could impress people around the world. He continued, I also know that some employers publicize their restructuring plan to improve their financial performance by letting a number of their employees go. But at Nintendo, employees make valuable contributions in their respective fields, so I believe that laying off a group of employees will not help to strengthen Nintendo's business in the long run. Studies back this up. Oxford found that workers are 13% more productive when happy. They work faster, harder, take less sick days, have a positive impact on the other employees around them, and are less likely to leave. Who'd have thought? Crazy. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the president of From Software, also agreed with Iwata, saying, I think it was the old ex-president of Nintendo, Iwata-san, who said that people who are afraid of losing their jobs are afraid of making good things. I'm paraphrasing that, but I totally share this view. Basically, Japanese companies are not magically immune from the financial struggles the games industry is facing, nor are they any more charitable than American companies. They are still laying off plenty of people. A company is a company is a company. Really, they're just operating under different legal parameters and a different business culture in general. It is much easier, almost infinitely easier, to lay someone off in the US from a legal standpoint, and doing so doesn't fly in the face of a long-established corporate culture that really focuses on long-term employee retention. There are, of course, as alluded to, many downsides of not being able to fire workers who aren't performing, and Japanese workers still have their fair share of mistreatment. But I will say it's pretty difficult to argue against one of them. People can surely build better games when they don't spend every morning wondering if they're the next one to get fired.
So this really was just an elaborate rant so she could complain about the American labor market, and the examples she cited weren't even particularly conclusive in supporting what she's arguing. If anything, she's highlighting the constraints of the Japanese labor market while simultaneously providing one of the most reductionist presentations of the American labor market imaginable. At no point does she talk about the value of having workforce agility or employment agility. At no point does she talk about the advantages that flexibility provides entrepreneurs, employers, or workers, or the ability of companies to restructure, develop new titles, create new products, and adapt to changing market conditions. Instead, it's this incredibly one-sided point of view where, because Japan has stronger restrictions primarily around firing employees, therefore the Japanese labor market is better than the American labor market. And America sucks, by the way. That's literally the title of her video. America sucks, by the way. And to substantiate that enormous conclusion, she basically focuses on two things: at-will employment and healthcare. I mean, this has to be some of the most low IQ propaganda I have ever seen. I genuinely don't understand who the hell this is supposed to appeal to. She is getting some pushback on X and in her comments, including people pointing out what they see as hypocrisy of complaining about corporate greed in America while simultaneously having a corporate sponsor, Raycon, in her video. The whole thing is just all over the place. It's profoundly misinformed, and it's just such a myopic view of the United States labor market and the advantages that market provides American companies. And by the way, the United States has far more startup activity than virtually any comparable developed economy and remains the undisputed global leader in startup scale, high-value companies, venture capital, and financial investment. According to global startup ecosystem trackers and macroeconomic data, the United States accounts for an enormous share of global startup activity. The scale of America's entrepreneurial landscape can be understood through its sheer volume, the number of high-value companies it produces, and its financial dominance. And again, if you create a highly regulated labor market, you risk undermining some of the advantages that America has over countries like Japan. Japan, in fact, as she discussed, is struggling with a constraining workforce, including a shrinking working age population and intense competition for younger workers. And that's part of the context that has to be considered when we're talking about companies paying substantially higher starting salaries to college graduates. If companies are competing aggressively for a shrinking pool of young workers while simultaneously operating within a system where terminating employees can be considerably more difficult, then naturally they're going to be much more cautious about whom they hire and what those employees cost over the long term. And that can have consequences for the development of good products as well. It's not a one-to-one thing that you get a good product because somebody spent their entire life working for a company. In fact, that's one of the most retarded things I have ever heard. It also doesn't matter what kind of intellectual property or institutional knowledge an employee may have. Knowledge is transferable, and sometimes some of the greatest ideas come from new people entering an organization and completely revolutionizing the way an intellectual property is viewed. We've seen versions of that happen with Marvel and DC over the last 2 decades. Marvel traditionally had properties created and developed by generations of creatives, and then as different pieces of its intellectual property became involved with companies such as Disney and Sony and were adapted by new filmmakers, writers, actors, producers, and creative teams, those properties exploded into this enormous interconnected entertainment universe. The result was one of the most historically successful movie and entertainment franchises the world has ever seen. That's part of the value of having people people and ideas move around rather than assuming that keeping the same person in the same company for their entire career is inherently superior. Now, additionally, the agility that the American marketplace has doesn't just lead to the creation of startups in raw numbers. The American market also leads heavily in producing high-value, highly impactful companies. The United States is home to well over 1,000 unicorn startups. That's several times the number found in China. And unicorn startups, by the way, are privately held startup companies valued at more than $1 billion. Now, all that being said, let's actually look at Japan because she's the one trying to compare Japan to the United States. Again, the United States is number 1 in the global ecosystem ranking for startups. Japan is number 18. That means the United States maintains a massive, undisputed lead over Japan in overall startup strength, market size, and global impact. In fact, the United States generates more than 1.5 million startups, while Japan generates roughly 10,000. The United States is close to 1,100 active unicorns. As I mentioned, Japan has 10. Annual venture capital in the United States is roughly $328 billion, while in Japan, it's just about $5 billion. So when you're trying to compare these two systems and present Japan's labor market as though it is obviously superior to the American labor market, you have to contend with these numbers. These aren't remotely comparable entrepreneurial ecosystems. America absolutely dominates Japan when it comes to startup creation, unicorn creation, venture capital, and the overall scale of a startup ecosystem. Now, if we want to look at culture as well, this also plays into the at-will work culture that she mentioned, and I keep coming back to it because it is a point she tried to make. In the United States, failure is highly normalized and often viewed as a valuable badge of experience for serial entrepreneurs. Additionally, top talent routinely leaves stable jobs for high equity startup upside. And what does that mean? It means that employment flexibility doesn't exclusively benefit the employer. It benefits the employee as well. If you're tied down to a job and you don't have that flexibility, you can't just go and potentially make a massive payday at another company because guess what? You're tied down to the company you're already working for. That's risk, okay? In the American system, somebody can leave a stable job, join a startup, take equity instead of guaranteed security, and potentially make an enormous amount of money if that company succeeds. That mobility is part of the system. Japan, on the other hand, has historically been much more risk averse. A legacy preference for stable, lifelong corporate employment meant that starting a business was historically viewed as overly reckless. Now, this is starting to change, and Japan is developing more of a startup culture. But that being said, 91.5% of Japanese startups survive past their first 3 years, reflecting a highly methodical, lower-risk style of building companies. Again, that tells you something about the fundamental difference between these two cultures. The American system is much more willing to tolerate risk, failure, people leaving companies, companies failing, new companies replacing them, and entrepreneurs trying again. That creates instability, sure, but it also creates enormous opportunities for innovation, investment, and growth. And look, I'm not saying all this to do what she's doing, which is to simply say that one system is better than the other in every conceivable way. I have a personal preference. I love the United States. I like the United States labor market and entrepreneurial startup market better than any other market in the world, not just Japan's, every other market in the world. I think the United States is the greatest nation to ever exist. That's why I live here. She, on the other hand, is from Australia, chose to make a video titled America Sucks, by the way, and just try to say that Japan has a better labor market. If you don't like it, then just leave. We don't need to put up with your propaganda. Who cares? Anyway, you tell me what you think in the comments down below. I hope you have a terrific day. Make sure you like and subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, share with a friend if you think they would enjoy it as well, and I will see you in the next one. Take care. Peace.